Kara Montgomery's life was a testament to success. A self-made woman who had built her career from the ground up. A well-known name in the world of finance, she was the CEO of a thriving investment firm, with millions under her management. Yet, as she sat at a small coffee shop in a corner of the city, wearing nothing but a simple black blazer and jeans, no one would have guessed she was one of the most powerful women in the room. Kara preferred it that way. The coffee shop, Penny's Brew, was nestled between two towering glass buildings in the heart of the business district. Despite its proximity to the financial powerhouses that dotted the skyline, it had managed to retain a humble, local charm. Kara sat at a worn wooden table, sipping her cappuccino slowly, her eyes on her phone. The buzz of the city outside, the clicking of heels on the pavement, and the muffled conversations of other patrons all blended into the background. But her attention remained focused. Her phone buzzed again. Another call from one of her senior managers at the firm. It was always something urgent. Kara swiped the notification away, sighing. She knew she had a dozen things to tend to, but at this moment, she just wanted a few minutes of peace. She had built this life for herself after years of struggle, coming from a background where financial hardships were a constant companion. The transition from a struggling college graduate to one of the most respected figures in the business world hadn't been easy. There had been plenty of sleepless nights, countless sacrifices, and the constant need to prove herself in a world that often doubted her based on the color of her skin. Today, though, it was different. She didn't need to be the powerful CEO right now. She just wanted to be herself, to be seen as a person, not as a title. The door of the coffee shop jingled as it opened, bringing in a rush of cool air. Kara glanced up briefly, noting the entry of a couple in business attire. The woman, blonde and impeccably dressed, glared briefly at Kara, clearly sizing her up before moving past. Kara looked away quickly, the encounter feeling oddly familiar, like a glance from someone who expected her to be a lower-tier employee, not someone who commanded a room. It was something Kara was used to, being underestimated based on her appearance. People saw her, a black woman in a modest outfit, and didn't instantly recognize the power she held. They assumed she was just another person in the crowd, and that's the way she liked it. But she could feel their eyes linger. They had no idea who she was. How could they? Kara's peace was interrupted by a voice from the next table. "Excuse me," the voice called, dripping with condescension. Kara turned to see a man, mid-40s, with a slick haircut and a tailored suit, looking at her expectantly. His eyes were sharp, scanning her from top to bottom. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked, though his tone suggested it was more of an accusation than a question. Kara paused, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Pardon?" she replied, lifting her eyebrows, her voice steady but guarded. "I just thought." He trailed off with a slight shrug. "This is a business coffee shop. It's a bit odd for someone like you to be sitting here alone. Don't you think?" Kara blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his assumption. It wasn't the first time she had been asked something like that, and probably not the last. The man didn't recognize her. She could tell from his confused expression and the lack of respect in his tone. To him, she was just another black woman in a coffee shop, not someone who was capable of pulling in millions in investment capital or closing billion-dollar deals. Kara straightened in her chair, her calm exterior betraying the growing sense of irritation inside. "I'm just enjoying my coffee," she said slowly, her gaze unwavering, meeting his eyes with an almost amused confidence. "What's odd about that?" He paused, clearly thrown off by her unflinching demeanor. "I just thought." He hesitated, clearly choosing his words with care, though the doubt in his voice was evident. "You know, maybe you're just new to this area?" Kara could feel the familiar sting of the assumption hanging in the air. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't even looked at her with the courtesy of someone who understood that she might belong in the same room as he did. It was all too familiar. The constant battle of proving herself without asking for any acknowledgement, of being seen but not really seen. "No," she said with finality, her voice growing colder. "I've been in this area for years." The man blinked, clearly taken aback by her composure and sharp response. But instead of backing off, he gave a half-smile, as if to mask his unease. "Ah, well, that's good to hear. Just trying to make conversation, I guess." His attempt at easing the situation fell flat, but he awkwardly stood up and walked away. Kara watched him go, her eyes narrowing as she took another sip of her cappuccino. The encounter had been brief, but in those few moments, the invisible walls of prejudice had made themselves clear. She had been assumed to be out of place, even in a setting as innocuous as this. It was a reality she faced often, one that many people like her faced, no matter their achievements. The ringing of her phone broke her from her thoughts. It was her assistant, Mark. "Kara." His voice came through, urgent but composed. "The board meeting's been moved up. They want you there in 30 minutes. I know you're supposed to be on leave, but they're insisting." Kara's heart sank. She had been hoping for a quiet day, but there was no getting around it. The firm's board was relentless, always pushing for more. With a long exhale, she stood, pulling her blazer tight around her shoulders as she grabbed her purse. "Got it. I'll be there soon," she said, her voice calm despite the quickening pace of her thoughts. She paused for a moment before hanging up, reflecting on how much she had already given, and how much more she would have to. As she turned toward the door, Kara couldn't help but wonder if she would ever be truly seen for who she was, or if she would always be someone who had to fight for her place in the world. As Kara Montgomery entered the building for the rescheduled board meeting, her mind was already running through the usual drills. She'd been through countless meetings just like this one. The same faces, the same rehearsed lines, the same dismissive attitudes from some of the more senior members who still seemed to have a hard time acknowledging her authority. They knew who she was, of course. She had earned her place. But they still looked at her with the kind of skepticism that only someone who had spent their life fighting against the grain could understand. They saw her as a black woman, a leader in finance, and they struggled to reconcile the two. She stepped off the elevator and into the sleek, glass-walled conference room, where the board members were already seated. The whitewashed walls were adorned with abstract art that spoke volumes about the money that flowed through this room. Artificial beauty designed to distract from the true power dynamics at play. Kara set her purse down on the table and took her seat at the head of the room, the cold, polished surface of the table reflecting her composed expression. The chairman, a middle-aged man with graying hair, looked up from his notes. "Ah, Kara," he said with a small nod, though his eyes briefly flicked to the clock on the wall as if to suggest she was late. "Glad you could join us." Kara offered a calm smile. She was used to the passive-aggressive remarks. "Good to be here, as always." There was a subtle but telling pause before one of the senior executives, an older man named Richard, cleared his throat. "We need to address some concerns, Kara. The numbers are troubling. The portfolio's underperformed, and it's raised some eyebrows in the higher-ups." Kara felt a sharp sting in her chest but masked it quickly. She had known the conversation would turn this way. Despite the success of her firm, despite all her hard work, it was always her performance that was scrutinized more closely than anyone else's. Richard's voice dripped with condescension, and she couldn't help but notice the slight glance he exchanged with a few of the others at the table. His eyebrows raised just slightly, as though expecting her to crack under the pressure. "I'm aware of the concerns," Kara said evenly, her fingers clasped on the table in front of her. "I've already initiated changes to address the weaknesses in the portfolio. I'm confident we'll see improvements by the next quarter." Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "You understand the gravity of the situation, don't you?" His tone was not just questioning but laden with the kind of subtle dismissal that Kara had come to know too well. "We're not talking about minor setbacks here." Kara's gaze didn't waver. "I'm well aware of the situation, Richard. I also understand that trust is earned, and I've spent my entire career proving myself. I have full confidence that we will turn this around. I don't need to remind anyone at this table that my leadership has brought us here." There was a brief silence in the room, but it was enough for Kara to feel the unspoken judgments still lingering in the air. She wasn't just the CEO of this firm. She was a black woman who had fought against the tide of systemic racism in every step of her career, and despite her undeniable success, the racial bias was still there, tucked behind the smiles and formalities. They couldn't ignore her accomplishments, but they certainly weren't willing to acknowledge them as effortlessly as they did her colleagues. Her worth had always been doubted, her abilities questioned, and even now, as the most successful person in the room, she knew there were those who still thought of her as the exception rather than the rule. Kara could feel the weight of their stares. They didn't know how much it had cost her to get here, how many sleepless nights spent strategizing, working, clawing her way to the top, only to be constantly reminded that her skin color was a constant obstacle she would always have to prove she had overcome. "I suggest," Richard continued, "that we consider making some leadership changes if the numbers don't improve by next quarter. We can't afford to take risks with the firm's future." Kara felt the familiar knot in her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. "That won't be necessary. I've got a strategy in place, and I believe in the team I've put together. If we need to adjust anything, we'll do it together." Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You know, Kara, I think you're being a bit too confident. It's all well and good to talk big, but there's a reason people in this industry are cautious, especially with someone, no offense, like you."
Kara froze.
The words, "someone like you," hung in the air like a cruel, invisible accusation. She knew exactly what he meant. He wasn't talking about her qualifications or her experience. He was talking about her skin color, the way it didn't belong in spaces like these. He had used every word in his arsenal to make her feel like she had to earn her place, to justify why she deserved to be at the table, even when she was already one of the most successful CEOs in the industry. But Kara wasn't about to let him get away with it. She straightened in her chair and met his eyes with an unwavering gaze. "Someone like me?" she asked, her voice low but filled with authority.
No, Richard.
"I don't think you understand. I'm here because of my capabilities. I've earned my place here, and I will continue to prove that to you and anyone else who doubts me." The room went still. There was a slight shift in the atmosphere, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for Richard to respond. He hesitated, his confident smirk faltering for just a moment before he cleared his throat and quickly shifted the conversation. "Well, I suppose we'll see how things go," he muttered, clearly looking for any way to avoid further confrontation. "But I'm just saying, it's something we'll have to keep an eye on." Kara didn't respond, but her mind was racing. She had grown used to being underestimated, used to being treated as less than. But it didn't get easier. Every time someone like Richard spoke to her this way, it chipped away at something deep inside her. But she wasn't about to show it. Not today. Not ever. As the meeting wore on, she pushed through the discomfort, her mind working as she focused on the financial reports in front of her. But every once in a while, her thoughts would return to Richard's words. The insidious, indirect racism that still simmered beneath the surface of every interaction she had in spaces like these. It was never overt. It didn't need to be. It was always the little things, the subtle digs, the looks of skepticism. She could feel it in every word, every gesture. It was the silent assumption that no matter how successful she was, she would always have to prove herself just a little bit more. The meeting finally ended, but the tension didn't leave. Kara stood up, smoothing down the front of her blazer as she prepared to leave. As she gathered her things, she caught a glimpse of Richard whispering to another board member, his voice low. She didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. And she didn't care. What mattered now was that the fight wasn't over. When she walked out of the conference room, the weight of the encounter lingered. Her heart still raced with the frustration of being undervalued, but she had learned long ago that this was her battle. Every step, every achievement, every victory, it had all been a fight against the system. But Kara Montgomery wasn't backing down. The day outside was sunny, and as she walked toward her car, she saw the reflection of herself in the glass walls of the building. A successful black woman, unbroken, unyielding. She was ready for whatever came next, even if it was more of the same. But as she reached the parking lot, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from her assistant, Mark. Something's come up. We need to talk. It's about the firm. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't over. There was more to the story, more to the fight, and Kara was ready to face it head-on. Kara Montgomery's heart pounded as she stepped off the elevator and into the building's underground parking lot. The air felt dense, heavy with anticipation and the unspoken tensions that had been brewing all day. She had just come from a grueling 3-hour meeting with the board, and now, the confrontation she knew was coming had finally arrived. The text from Mark had said it all. Something's come up. We need to talk. It's about the firm. Kara's phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from her assistant.
Urgent.
There's been a leak. We need to meet ASAP. Kara clenched her fists, her fingers digging into the sleek leather of her purse. She could feel the weight of the words. A leak. This wasn't just a corporate issue. It was personal. The rumors had already started circulating, and she knew what that meant. This wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This was about undermining her. As she walked toward her car, a sleek black Lexus parked near the exit. Her thoughts raced. What could have happened? She had been meticulously careful, watching her every move. But this was the kind of betrayal she had always feared. No matter how high she rose, no matter how much she achieved, the system would never see her as fully legitimate. Not as long as she was a black woman leading in a space dominated by old money, old white men. She slid into the driver's seat, her hand briefly resting on the smooth leather steering wheel before gripping it with resolve. Kara wasn't going to let this define her. She had worked too hard to get here. But as she turned the key in the ignition, she knew that the Real fight was only just beginning. The drive to the office was long enough for Kara to calm her nerves, but her mind raced with possibilities. She'd been in the corporate world long enough to know that leaks like this didn't happen by accident. Someone, probably someone close to her, someone on the inside, was trying to tear her down. The firm's rivals, the ones who would benefit most from her failure, had been watching her closely for months, waiting for a crack. And now they had one. The office was quiet when Kara entered, the kind of silence that speaks volumes. Mark was already there, waiting for her. His serious expression immediately told her everything she needed to know. "You're not going to believe this," he said, standing as she walked in. Kara closed the door behind her and took a deep breath, steeling herself. What happened? Mark's eyes flicked to the computer screen behind him, where a series of emails and documents were open. There's been an internal leak. A sensitive report got into the hands of our competitors, and they've already started making calls to clients, claiming that there's mismanagement in the leadership. They're trying to paint you as incompetent, Kara. This is bad. Kara's chest tightened. Her entire career had been about proving that she was more than capable, more than competent. She had shattered every glass ceiling, and now someone wanted to reduce her to the angry black woman trope. The thought filled her with a fury she could barely contain. They can't just do this. This isn't just a leak. This is sabotage, Kara said, her voice low but full of the fire she was starting to reignite. She stepped forward, looking at the screen. She recognized the names of the companies that had been involved in the leak. They've got someone on the inside, Kara muttered. I know it. Someone close to us. Mark nodded. I've been running background checks all day. It's either someone from the executive team or someone in the firm's legal department. But no matter who it is, they've got a target on you. Kara slammed her fist onto the desk, the loud bang making Mark flinch. But she was beyond caring. She had spent her life fighting against the narrative that people like her were only there by chance or through some token gesture. This time they had gone too far. Find out who it is. No one messes with me like this, Kara said, her voice now steely and determined. Get me a name, Mark. The next few days were a whirlwind of frantic meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. Kara knew the stakes were high, and if she was going to fight back, she needed to be strategic. She couldn't just go in guns blazing. That would play into their hands. No, she needed a plan. Something that would not only expose the traitor but also send a clear message to the board and her rivals that she was not to be underestimated. By the time the sun had set on the 4th day after the leak, Kara had a list of suspects. Every piece of information Mark had uncovered pointed to one name: Richard Harris. The same Richard who had subtly undermined her in the board meeting just a week ago. The same Richard who had made those offhand remarks about someone like you. Kara's blood ran cold as she thought back to that moment. Richard had always been a snake, but she hadn't expected him to go this far. The suspicion in his eyes, the arrogance in his voice. It all made sense now. He'd seen her as a threat, a challenge to the status quo, and he had decided to do something about it. The next morning, Kara made her move. She arrived at the office before anyone else, her mind already sharpened by the knowledge that she was about to bring everything into the light. She needed to be calm, composed, and precise. She walked into her office and immediately placed a call to her attorney. "I need you to prepare a legal brief," Kara said into the phone, her voice steady. "I'm going to confront Richard today. I need everything in place to take him down if it comes to that." The line was silent for a moment. "Are you sure? You've got a lot at stake here, Kara." "I'm sure," Kara replied. "Let's get it done." By the time Richard Harris arrived, Kara had everything in place. She knew that confronting him directly would be risky, but she wasn't about to let him walk away with the satisfaction of knowing he'd won. She needed to show him that he had underestimated her, and that she was no longer the token CEO, but a force to be reckoned with. When Richard stepped off the elevator, he was greeted by Kara's cold stare. He didn't immediately register the tension in the air, his usual cocky smirk in place as he walked toward her office. "Good morning, Kara," he said, his tone as patronizing as ever. "I trust everything's going well on your end?" Kara leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "Sit down, Richard." His expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. He took a seat across from her, his body language shifting from casual to defensive. "Is there something I can do for you?" Kara didn't waste any time. "You've been busy lately, haven't you?" she said, her eyes never leaving his. "Spreading rumors, trying to undermine me, leaking sensitive information. You've been working hard to destroy everything I've built." Richard's face paled slightly. "What are you talking about?" Kara didn't flinch. She pushed a folder across the desk toward him, the documents inside it speaking volumes. "I have everything I need, Richard. I know what you did." His breath caught in his throat, but he quickly regained his composure. "You don't have anything. I've done nothing wrong." Kara's eyes narrowed. "That's where you're wrong. I've already put everything in motion. Your little betrayal ends today." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You think you can intimidate me, Kara? You don't know what you're messing with. You're not the only one who has connections in this industry." Kara stood as well, her voice low but filled with an unmistakable resolve. "I've fought my entire life to get here. I've worked harder than any of you ever could. You can't intimidate me, Richard, but I will bring you down." As Richard backed out of her office, his face contorted with rage and disbelief, Kara felt a sense of triumph begin to surge inside her. She wasn't done yet, but she knew that this confrontation was just the beginning. Now all that was left was the fallout. The following day, Kara's office felt colder than usual. The air, thick with the weight of her decision, was punctuated only by the rhythmic sound of her fingers tapping against the desk. She had spoken to Mark and the plan was set. Richard Harris, her rival, had to be stopped. This wasn't just about the leak. It was about something deeper, something that had been festering beneath the surface for years. The corporate world, especially one so entrenched in traditional ways of thinking, wasn't ready for someone like her, not truly. Not a black woman in a position of power, no matter how much she had proven herself. The next step was clear. Richard had to be exposed not just for the leak, but for the systemic biases he represented. And Kara wasn't going to let him walk away without consequences. She heard a knock at the door, breaking her concentration. Mark entered, his expression grim. His eyes lingered on her for a moment before he spoke, as if considering what to say. "You know the board is already talking," he began, crossing the room and taking a seat opposite her. Richards had time to cover his tracks. They're questioning whether this is personal. They don't care about the leak, Kara, they care about the optics. Kara exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. It's always about the optics, isn't it? They can't see the forest for the trees. Mark nodded. Exactly. And the worst part? They're giving Richard the benefit of the doubt. He's been here longer. He's more established. Kara's jaw tightened. The message was clear. No matter how much she had accomplished, no matter how many victories she had won, there would always be someone waiting to pull the rug out from under her. But Kara Montgomery wasn't about to be that easy a target. She stood up, pacing around the office, her mind whirring. If they're going to turn a blind eye, then I'll make sure they can't look away. Her voice was low but filled with resolve. We need to get ahead of this, before Richard tries to twist the narrative. Mark looked up at her, his eyes a mix of concern and admiration. And how do you plan on doing that? Kara paused for a moment, her hand resting on the window ledge. She looked out at the city below. The sprawling skyscrapers, the corporate empire she had spent so many years climbing to build. She wasn't about to let any of it be tainted by Richard's scheme. We expose him, she said quietly. But not just for the leak. We need to go deeper. We need to show the board and the firm what he really is. Mark's brow furrowed. You're talking about going public with everything? Kara turned to face him. I'm talking about showing them that the people they're trusting are the ones who've been keeping them blind. Richard's just a symptom. The real problem is the system that keeps letting people like him operate unchecked. It's time for accountability. Mark nodded slowly. All right, but this could blow up in your face, Kara. You know that. I'm willing to take that risk, Kara replied. If I don't, who will? The decision was made. It wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about showing the world how far-reaching the rot went. Kara wasn't just fighting for her career. She was fighting for every person who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or marginalized simply because they didn't fit the mold. Later that day, Kara found herself in another meeting, this time with a group of trusted allies. Mitchell, one of her key advisors, and a few others who had witnessed her rise from the very beginning. Mitchell, a tall, well-groomed man in his mid-40s, had always been there for Kara, and he had seen the lengths she had gone to prove herself in a world that often tried to put her in a box. Kara didn't waste any time. We need to get ahead of the story, she said, her tone sharp and direct. Richard Harris is behind the leak. I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. Mitchell, who had been quietly listening, cleared his throat. You're playing a dangerous game, Kara, he said, his voice steady but concerned. Richard's not just any rival. He's got connections. A lot of them. He's well liked by the board. Kara didn't flinch. I don't care who he's liked by. He's trying to destroy everything I've built. And it's not just about me anymore, Mitchell. This is about changing the culture here, about showing them that they can't hide behind their biases anymore. They can't keep perpetuating this system of favoritism. Mitchell nodded slowly, his eyes filled with understanding. I get it. But if we do this, we're putting ourselves on the line. The fallout won't just be corporate, it'll be personal. Richard's not going down without a fight. I'm prepared for that, Kara said, her gaze unwavering. Are you? The room went silent. Mitchell held her stare for a moment, as if weighing the risks. Finally, he spoke. I'm with you, Kara. I always have been. But we'll need to move quickly. If we don't act fast, we'll be the ones on the defensive. Kara smiled faintly. That's the plan. The next few days were a blur of activity. Kara and Mark worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, connecting the dots, and preparing for the moment when they would go public. Richard, in the meantime, seemed unaware of how close his grip on power was slipping. He was still maneuvering behind the scenes, trying to salvage what little credibility he had left. But every step he took made him more predictable, more desperate. Kara knew that she couldn't let him control the narrative any longer. She couldn't afford to wait until the situation got worse. The longer she let him fester, the more he would damage her, and everyone who had ever supported her. And then, just as she had expected, Richard made his move. It was late in the afternoon when Kara received a call from her assistant. Her face was unreadable as she listened to the words on the other end. She had known this was coming, but hearing it made the reality hit harder. "It's the board," her assistant said, voice tight with urgency. "They want to see you immediately. It's about the leak." Kara's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. As she walked toward the elevator, her mind was already working through the possibilities. The board was about to make their move, and she knew that this meeting would determine the course of her future, both at the firm and in her career. Would they stand by her, or would they fold under pressure, letting Richard's machinations win? The elevator doors closed behind her, and she took a deep breath, preparing herself for the confrontation. Her resolve was clear. No matter what happened in that room, she was going to fight. She would not let her success be overshadowed by someone else's selfish agenda. When the doors opened, Kara stepped into the boardroom, her heart pounding, but her expression calm. The tension in the room was palpable. Richard was there, sitting with the board members, his face a mask of feigned innocence. "Ms. Montgomery," one of the senior board members said, his tone neutral, but with an underlying tension. "Please have a seat. We need to discuss the recent events." Kara didn't sit down immediately. She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each person there. She could feel the weight of the moment. The stakes had never been higher. "Before we begin," Kara said, her voice sharp and commanding, "I think you should know that I know exactly who's behind the leak, and I'm not here to apologize for something I didn't do." The room fell silent, and for the first time since walking in, Kara felt the collective weight of everyone's attention on her. Richard's eyes flickered, but he didn't speak. Kara didn't need him to. She was done being the silent one in the room. "Richard Harris," she said, her voice rising, "has been leaking sensitive information about me, about this firm, in order to undermine everything I've worked for." The gasps around the table were almost imperceptible, but they were there. Richard shifted in his seat, but Kara didn't look away. She knew this was her moment. "You can't let him walk away from this," Kara said, locking eyes with each board member. "Because if you do, then you're saying that the truth doesn't matter, that the integrity of this firm doesn't matter, and that the people who fight the hardest to prove themselves are just disposable." Kara could feel the shift. It was subtle, but it was there. She had made her stand, and now all she had to do was wait. The atmosphere in the boardroom was thick with tension as Kara stood her ground, unwavering. The weight of the moment felt like a vice around her chest, but she remained calm, her posture straight and her gaze piercing as she addressed the room. Every eye was on her now, and Richard Harris, the man who had tried to undermine her career and tarnish everything she had built, sat across from her, seething with frustration. "You think you can just walk in here and accuse me?" Richard's voice was a low, mocking sneer, laced with venom. His hands were clenched on the table, and Kara could see the strain in his neck, the way his jaw tightened as he struggled to maintain composure. But she wasn't intimidated. She knew the game he was playing, and she wasn't about to let him win. Kara leaned forward slightly, not breaking eye contact with Richard. "I know what you've been doing. I know you've been leaking information about me, about the firm, and I have the proof. It's not just a coincidence that you've been trying to sabotage my career." Richard's face twisted into a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Proof? You don't have anything. This is just your desperation talking. You think the board is going to believe your story over mine." The board members, who had been silent until now, exchanged glances, some of them uneasy, others unsure. Kara could feel the weight of their doubt in the air, but she wasn't going to let them sway her. "You're right, Richard," Kara said, her voice steady. "It's not just about you leaking information. It's about the way you've manipulated the system to keep people like me down. It's about your systemic bias, your complete disregard for fairness. You've been trying to tear this place apart from the inside, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." Richard's face faltered for a moment, and Kara saw the flicker of something she recognized. Fear. But it was quickly masked, replaced by a hollow smirk. "And what do you expect to do about it? Go public with your accusations? You'll ruin everything you've worked for. The board won't stand for it. They'll cut you loose. Kara stood taller, her gaze unwavering. She had spent years working harder than anyone else in that room, proving her worth, and she wasn't going to back down now. I expect to do what I've always done, fight. And I won't do it alone. I'm bringing the truth with me. Richard's expression soured as the truth hit him. Kara had no intention of letting this be a quiet battle. She would make sure everyone knew who Richard really was. His lies, his manipulation, it was all going to be exposed. He could try to take her down, but he wasn't going to destroy her. Not today. Not ever. As Kara spoke, she could feel the shift in the room. A couple of the board members, those who had been silent and watching her cautiously, finally looked her way, their eyes softening just a fraction. There was a crack in their armor, the beginnings of doubt. But she needed more. She needed them to see the truth. She wasn't going to let Richard walk away from this. Do you really think they'll believe you? Richard spat, leaning forward in his chair, his voice harsh. You're nothing but a token, Kara. You think you've made it because of your hard work? No, it's because they needed someone who fit the mold they could control. Someone who could make them look good. But at the end of the day, you're just like the rest of us. Just trying to climb to the top. And the second they see what you really are, they'll toss you aside like they've done with everyone else. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thickening with his words. But Kara didn't flinch. She wasn't a token. She had earned her place. And if Richard wanted to believe that he could intimidate her, he was sorely mistaken. You're wrong, she said, her voice unwavering. I didn't get here by being a token. I got here by fighting for every inch. And I'll keep fighting. Richard's smirk faltered for a moment, and Kara knew she had struck a nerve. She wasn't just going to expose him. She was going to make sure everyone knew how deep his corruption ran. This wasn't just about a leak. This was about the culture of entitlement and bias that had been allowed to thrive within this firm. And Richard was just the tip of the iceberg. The board members, most of whom had been silent observers, were beginning to murmur amongst themselves. Kara could see them shifting uncomfortably, their unease palpable. Richard was losing control, and that was when she made her move. With a controlled breath, Kara pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the table in front of her. I've been gathering evidence, she said, sliding it toward the center of the table. Documents, emails, conversations, everything you need to understand what's been going on behind the scenes. This isn't just hearsay, it's facts. Richard's face blanched as the folder slid toward him, his eyes darting from the documents to Kara's unwavering gaze. You can't prove anything, he said, though his voice now lacked the conviction it had earlier. Kara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to the board, meeting each of their gazes. I'm not just asking for your attention, she said. I'm demanding it. The truth has been buried long enough. I've put up with being underestimated, with people like Richard pulling the strings behind the scenes, and I've had enough. One of the board members, a man Kara had always respected for his level-headedness, spoke up. We'll need to look into this, he said, his voice tight with concern. But if these accusations are true, Kara interrupted, it's not just Richard who's to blame. It's the system that allowed him to keep doing this. For far too long, people have been playing the game, thinking they're untouchable. But that ends now. Richard stood abruptly, knocking his chair back as he did. You're insane if you think you can take me down, he said, his voice rising, the facade cracking. You don't know who you're dealing with. Kara stood, her own voice calm but filled with the weight of her conviction. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Richard. And that's why I'm going to make sure the world knows too. The room was silent for a long beat. The tension was almost unbearable. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say another word, the door to the boardroom opened. A tall woman in a sharp suit entered, her presence commanding. Kara didn't recognize her at first, but the way she moved, confident and purposeful, told her everything she needed to know. The woman walked up to the table and turned to the board. I'm here to support Kara Montgomery, she said, her voice steady and strong. I'm with the Internal Affairs team, and I'm here to make sure this investigation is handled correctly. Richard's eyes widened in recognition. You can't be serious, he muttered, taking a step back. The realization that he was no longer in control was sinking in, and Kara could see the panic rising in him. This is just the beginning, Richard, Kara said, her voice low but unwavering. You won't get away with this. Not this time. But as the woman stepped closer to the table, Richard's shoulders slumped, and he looked at Kara with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He knew that this fight was lost. But even in his defeat, he wasn't ready to back down. Kara's heart raced. She had done it. She had exposed Richard for what he was, and in doing so, she had exposed the broken system that allowed him to thrive. But the fight wasn't over yet. The door slammed shut behind Richard as he was escorted out of the room, and the tension in the air began to lift. But Kara knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. As she turned to face the board members, she could feel the weight of the decision that lay ahead. Would they stand by her? Or would they continue to let the system protect people like Richard? She took a deep breath, knowing that no matter the outcome, she had already won. But the stakes were still high. The fight for justice, real, lasting justice, was far from over. And Kara Montgomery was ready to finish what she had started. Kara Montgomery stood at the front of the boardroom, every muscle in her body taut with tension. The lights above hummed faintly, casting long shadows over the polished conference table. She had fought for this moment, endured the whispers and the sneers, and now it was time to confront the man who had tried to destroy her career, Richard Harris. Across the table, Richard sat with his arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. He was no longer the confident executive Kara had once respected. His posture was defensive, his eyes flicking nervously as she spoke, but his arrogance was still palpable. Behind him, the board members remained silent, unsure of how to proceed, caught in the standoff between power and justice. You think you can just walk in here and accuse me of something like this? Richard said, his voice dripping with disdain. I don't know what game you're playing, Kara, but you're not going to win this. Kara didn't flinch. She had been called worse. She had been doubted, underestimated, dismissed. And now, standing at the precipice of her greatest challenge, she wasn't going to let Richard Harris, one man, full of privilege and fear, stop her. She straightened her back, a calm yet forceful presence in the room, and spoke again, her voice steady. I'm not playing any games, Richard. What I'm telling you is the truth. You've been running a scheme to discredit me, and I have the proof. Richard's face twisted into a mixture of surprise and anger. He hadn't expected Kara to be so direct, so bold. His eyes darted to the folder she had laid out on the table. The documents inside were damning: emails, financial records, and the key evidence that would bring everything crashing down. The truth had been right in front of him the whole time, but he had underestimated Kara's resolve. You think this will stop me? You think you can just hand me a couple of papers and expect me to fold? Richard sneered, his voice thick with arrogance. You're out of your depth. I've been doing this for years. No one is going to believe you over me. I've got connections, Kara. People who will protect me no matter what. His words hit her like a slap, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. I've heard that before. It's the same story every time. But the thing is, Richard, you've been lying to people who trusted you, to people who've worked beside you, and it's all coming to light now. Richard stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides, the desperation clear in his eyes. You think you can take everything from me? You think I'm just going to let you ruin my career over a few lies? Kara's voice remained calm, despite the intensity of the situation. You didn't ruin my career, Richard. You tried to, but you failed. You've underestimated me from the beginning, and now you're going to pay the price for that. I won't back down. Richard's gaze flickered, and for a moment, the arrogance faded. His mouth opened as if he was going to say something, but he hesitated, as if trying to regain control. He had seen Kara as nothing more than an obstacle, someone who didn't belong in his world. But now, he could see that she wasn't the same woman he had dismissed all those months ago. She had grown stronger, more formidable. She had found her voice, and it was too late for him to shut her up now. "You think I'm scared of you?" Richard scoffed, but there was a tremor in his voice. "You're just a black woman in a suit. You'll never be taken seriously. Not here. Not in this world." Kara's heart pounded, but she didn't let his words show. She had heard it all before. The racial bias, the insinuations, the assumptions. The world had always tried to limit her based on what they saw, never what she had accomplished. But today was different. She wasn't the woman they expected. She had worked too hard for this. She had earned her seat at the table, and she would be damned if she let anyone take it from her. "You're wrong," Kara said, her voice low but resolute. "I'm not here because of my skin color, Richard. I'm here because I've proven myself. I've fought for everything I've achieved, and that's something you'll never understand. I didn't get to where I am by playing by the rules you set. I got here by breaking them, by demanding respect when people like you thought I didn't deserve it." Richard took a step toward her, his face contorting with anger. "You don't know what it's like to be at the top. You don't know the sacrifices I've made, the deals I've had to make to get here. And now you think you can just come in and take it all away from me." Kara stood her ground, her feet planted firmly beneath her. "I know exactly what it's like to fight for every inch, Richard. And I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to expose the truth. The truth that you tried to hide from everyone else in this company. The truth that you've been using your position to manipulate and deceive. And now, it's time for you to face the consequences." The room had grown eerily silent. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Kara and Richard. They had known about the tensions between the two but had always hoped it would blow over. Now they were witnessing something far more dangerous. An unflinching confrontation between truth and power. Richard looked around at the board members, his face reddening. "You all are just going to sit there?" He spat, his voice rising. "You're going to let her?" "We're not sitting here, Richard." One of the board members, a woman named Susan, finally spoke up. Her voice was steady, but there was a clear sense of finality in her words. "We're listening, and it sounds like you've got some explaining to do." Richard's eyes widened in disbelief. His grip on the edge of the table tightened, his knuckles white. For the first time in years, Richard Harris didn't have control of the situation. And it was terrifying. "You can't do this," he hissed, his voice shaking. "You don't know who I am, what I've built. You think you can just come in here and take it all away?" Kara took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. This was the moment she would expose Richard for who he really was. The moment she would show the board, the company, and the world exactly what kind of man they had been putting their trust in. "I don't need to know who you are, Richard," Kara said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I know exactly what you've done, and I know exactly who you've become. And today it ends." The room was still. No one moved. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Richard seemed lost. His gaze flicked between Kara and the board members, but he knew there was no way out. He had underestimated her, misjudged her every step of the way. But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about all the people who had suffered under his reign. People who had been overlooked, dismissed, and silenced. Kara reached into the folder she had laid out on the table and pulled out the last piece of evidence. A signed document, irrefutable, a smoking gun. She laid it in front of him. "This," she said, "is the proof, and you'll never be able to explain it away." Richard's face drained of color as he stared down at the paper. His hands trembled, and for the first time in his career he felt vulnerable. He had always held the power, the control, the connections. But now, the very thing he had built was crumbling in front of him. Kara took a step back, her gaze steady. "You can keep trying to lie your way out of this, Richard, but the truth is out, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The room was heavy with silence, the board members still unsure of what to say. But one thing was clear, this was the moment Kara Montgomery had been fighting for. The door to the boardroom opened, and Kara stood tall, her resolve unwavering. The battle had been won. But as she walked out, her heart was still pounding. This wasn't over. The road to justice was long. But today, she had taken the first step. As she left the building, her phone buzzed. A message from Mark. "You did it. They're with you." And for the first time in a long time, Kara allowed herself to smile. The weeks following the explosive confrontation in the boardroom were a whirlwind for Kara Montgomery. The legal teams had gone into overdrive, scrambling to review the evidence she had presented. Richard Harris, once a titan in the corporate world, was now facing the consequences of his actions. The documents Kara had uncovered, and the revelations of his corruption, had struck like a bolt of lightning, leaving his reputation in tatters. He was suspended from his position as CEO, his assets were being investigated, and his connections no longer seemed to hold the same power they once had. But for Kara, the sense of victory was bittersweet. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The morning after the boardroom showdown, Kara sat in her office, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the paperwork spread before her. The city skyline outside her window was bathed in the soft glow of the early morning sun. It was a beautiful sight, but for Kara it felt almost out of reach. She had won, yes, but in the process, she had come face to face with the ugliness of systemic bias. Her career had almost been derailed by one man's prejudices and the larger forces that protected him. She had fought not just for her own redemption but for every person who had ever been overlooked, misjudged, or mistreated by the system. The road ahead was clearer now, but it was still fraught with obstacles. Her phone buzzed, and she looked down at the message from Mark Edwards. "We did it. The media is already starting to pick up the story. This is bigger than just the boardroom, Kara." Kara smiled, but there was no joy in her eyes. The media frenzy had already begun. Richard's downfall was being broadcast to every corner of the city, and with it, the injustices he had perpetuated. But she knew this wasn't about sensational headlines or public opinion. It was about dismantling the systems that allowed men like Richard Harris to thrive while others struggled against the weight of prejudice. The real work had only just begun. Her door opened, and her assistant, Laura, poked her head inside. "Ms. Montgomery, there's someone here to see you. They said it's urgent." Kara raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Send them in." A moment later, a woman entered, tall, with dark skin and sharp eyes, a sense of determination in her stance. Kara recognized her instantly. It was Susan Carter, a former employee of the company, one of many whose complaints about Richard had been dismissed over the years. Kara had heard bits and pieces of Susan's story, but she hadn't realized the depth of what had happened until now. Susan stood before Kara's desk, her arms crossed, but there was a softness in her eyes. "I know you're busy," she said, her voice steady but with an underlying note of urgency. "But I need to talk to you." Kara motioned to the chair across from her. "Sit down, Susan. What's going on?" Susan hesitated, then sank into the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's about the fallout. I don't think you realize how much people are talking about this. How many people you've helped, even if you didn't mean to." Kara raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Susan's voice grew firmer, more resolute. "Richard wasn't just a bad boss. He was a system. He controlled everything, the hiring, the firing, the promotions. He had his hands in everything, and anyone who wasn't part of his inner circle was pushed aside. But you brought him down, and people are noticing." Kara's pulse quickened. "You're saying this is bigger than just Richard?" "Exactly," Susan said, nodding. "I've been talking to others, former employees, people in different departments. We've all been through the same thing. The discrimination, the favoritism. It wasn't just Richard. It was the whole structure. And now that you've exposed him, people are starting to see that it wasn't just him, it was a culture of corruption." The weight of Susan's words sank in, and Kara felt a sense of gravity settle over her. This wasn't just one man who needed to be taken down. This was an entire system, a network of influence and bias that had been running unchecked for years. "I need your help, Kara," Susan continued, leaning forward. "People are finally ready to speak out, But we need someone to lead us. We need someone who has the power to make real change. And that someone is you. Kara's mind raced. She hadn't expected this conversation, but as the pieces began to fall into place, she saw the possibility of something bigger than her personal fight. This could be the catalyst for a movement that could change not just her company but the larger corporate world. She took a deep breath, standing up and walking over to the window. The city outside seemed both familiar and distant now. "I'm ready," she said quietly, turning back to Susan. "We've already exposed the truth about Richard, but we can't stop there. We need to dismantle the systems that allowed him to operate the way he did. We need to expose the corruption, the racial biases, the favoritism, and we need to make sure it never happens again." Susan's face lit up with hope. "You're willing to do this?" "I have to," Kara replied. "If we don't, nothing will change. This fight is bigger than Richard. It's bigger than me. It's for everyone who's been silenced, overlooked, and pushed aside." In the weeks that followed, Kara became the leader of a movement that was gaining traction. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was the voice of accountability in a company that had long been complicit in its own corruption. The media frenzy around Richard's downfall had ignited something deeper, a realization that the system could be challenged, and that those who had been overlooked could finally have their voices heard. Kara met with employees from every level of the company, listening to their stories, documenting the biases they had faced, and uncovering the systematic discrimination that had permeated every corner of the workplace. She reached out to external organizations, legal teams, and allies who had fought similar battles. And together, they began to build a case that went far beyond Richard Harris. Meanwhile, Richard's legal team fought back, attempting to salvage his reputation, but every time they tried to spin the narrative, Kara had the evidence to prove them wrong. His empire of influence was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But for Kara, the victory wasn't in his downfall, it was in the steps toward systemic change. Kara found herself at the forefront of corporate reform, not just within her company but in the broader business world. Her efforts sparked a conversation about the deeper issues of racism, privilege, and corruption that plagued every industry. She was no longer fighting for her own career. She was fighting for justice, for everyone who had been denied equal opportunities because of their race, gender, or background. One evening, Kara sat at her desk, reviewing the final draft of a proposal for company-wide diversity and inclusion reforms. She had come so far from the woman who had first walked into the boardroom, uncertain of her place in the world. Now she was a force to be reckoned with, a leader who had found her purpose. Her phone buzzed again. It was an email from Mark. "We've got the next step. It's time." Kara smiled, feeling a sense of peace. The fight was far from over, but she had taken the first steps toward real change. She glanced out the window again, at the city she had fought for and against. There would always be new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But Kara Montgomery had proven that one voice, one woman, could change the course of history. And she was just getting started. Kara Montgomery sat at the head of the conference table, her fingers lightly tapping against the polished surface. The room was filled with her closest allies, her legal team, colleagues, and a few trusted members from the broader community who had supported her throughout this fight. The glow from the setting sun cast long shadows across the room, as if the day itself was reflecting on the moments that had led them here. Kara's mind wasn't focused on the dimming light, though. She was lost in the weight of everything that had unfolded in the past few months. When she first set out to expose Richard Harris, she had no idea that her journey would lead to something so much bigger. It started as a battle for her own survival, protecting her career, her dignity, her name. But somewhere along the way, it transformed into a fight for justice on a larger scale. It wasn't just about one corrupt man. It was about a system built on assumptions, biases, and unchecked power. And Kara, once an insider, had become the agent of change. The final step of this journey had come in the form of a groundbreaking agreement. The corporation had finally agreed to implement a company-wide diversity and inclusion overhaul, one that would bring transparency to its hiring practices, hold people accountable for discriminatory actions, and actively combat the ingrained racism and favoritism that had long been allowed to fester. It was a victory, but it was just one step in the larger struggle. The true victory wasn't in the documents signed, the apologies made, or even the systemic change that would take years to fully manifest. The real victory lay in the realization that change was possible, that the system could be shaken, and that one person could make a difference. Kara leaned back in her chair, surveying the room. Her eyes settled on Mark Edwards, her ally in this entire endeavor. He had been there since the beginning, helping her navigate the complexities of the corporate world, offering advice, and providing a much-needed support system when she felt like everything was falling apart. His steady presence had been a beacon of hope during her darkest moments. And now it seemed like the winds were shifting. The conversation around the table was no longer about defending her position or undoing damage. It was about building a future where power didn't rest in the hands of the few, but in the many who were ready to rise up and demand justice. "You did it," Mark said, breaking her reverie. "You really did it." Kara smiled softly, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile that acknowledged the weight of what had been accomplished. She had taken on a corrupt system, confronted it head-on, and emerged stronger than ever. But she knew that the fight wasn't over. It was never just about this company. It was about something much larger, the way power was abused, the way people like her were overlooked or dismissed simply because of their race or background. "I didn't do it alone," Kara said, her voice steady. "This was all of us, together. Every single person who spoke up, who gave their testimony, who risked their career to expose the truth. This victory belongs to all of us." The team nodded in agreement, their faces marked by exhaustion, but also a sense of fulfillment. Kara's gaze wandered over to Susan Carter, the former employee who had approached her in the early stages of this process, urging her to take on this larger fight. Susan's face showed a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her voice had been part of the catalyst for this change. She, too, had been marginalized just like Kara, and now they were both fighting for something bigger than themselves. Kara's phone buzzed again. She glanced down and saw an email from the legal department. The message confirmed what she had suspected all along. The changes were going to take time, but they were happening. The CEO was out. The systemic overhaul was underway, and the media was picking up the story. This was more than just a company scandal. It was a public reckoning for corporate America. The story was shifting from one of corruption to one of redemption, not just for Kara, but for every employee who had been silenced in the face of inequality. The email also contained something else, a challenge. The media wanted an interview. The public wanted answers. They wanted to know how one woman, one black woman, had taken down a powerful figure and begun to reform a broken system. It was a challenge Kara was ready to take on. She wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for everyone who had been told they couldn't succeed, for every marginalized group whose voice had been silenced. She set the phone down, her resolve hardening. "I'm not done yet," she said, her voice low but firm. "There's a bigger conversation we need to have. Not just about diversity, not just about inclusion, but about the systems that keep us down. About the structures that protect the powerful while suffocating the rest of us." Mark nodded. "I know," he said, "but what you've done, what we've done, has started that conversation. And now it's time to take it public." The next few weeks were a blur of interviews, public appearances, and meetings. Kara's name was everywhere. Her face splashed across the media. But in all of it, she remained grounded. She never lost sight of the mission, the reason she had started this fight in the first place. The interviews weren't about her. It was about the story she was telling. The story of how systemic bias and racism had affected her, and so many others. And how, despite all the barriers, she had risen to challenge the very system that had tried to keep her down. But with the increased attention came resistance. There were those who saw Kara as a threat to the established order. Some board members had quietly expressed their discontent with the changes, and a few had even tried to quietly reverse some of the progress made. But Kara was no longer just fighting for her own place in the world. She was fighting for everyone who had been overlooked, for every person who had been subjected to the whims of a system designed to keep them in line. One day, after an especially heated meeting with some of the company's top executives, Kara stood by the window of her office, watching the city below. She was tired, deeply so, but the fire inside her had only grown stronger. She had faced so many challenges, from the initial clash with Richard Harris to the ongoing battle with the corporate structures that had allowed his actions to go unchecked. But now she knew she had a larger purpose. She wasn't just trying to fix one company. She was trying to break open the walls of a system that had kept inequality alive for generations. Her phone rang again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Susan. "I've been thinking," Susan began, her voice firm. "You've made it clear that this fight is bigger than just this company. So let's take this fight outside. Let's start working with other organizations, other industries. This isn't just about corporate reform. This is about society as a whole." Kara took a deep breath. She had known this moment was coming. She had been contemplating her next steps for weeks. She had already started the process of speaking with activists, leaders in other communities, and lawmakers who were also committed to making change. But now, hearing Susan's voice, Kara realized that this was the next logical step. "You're right," Kara said, her voice resolute. "It's time to take this to the next level." As the months passed, Kara's movement grew. The fight for corporate justice expanded into a nationwide effort for systemic change. Laws were passed, policies were reformed, and people from all walks of life, those who had been denied opportunities, marginalized, or silenced, began to find their voices. Kara didn't do this alone, but she was the spark that ignited the fire. Standing in front of a crowd at a rally one afternoon, Kara looked out at the sea of faces, so many of them hopeful, eager for change, ready to fight for a better world. She had fought her own battles, but now she was helping others win theirs. The fight was far from over, but as she looked out over the crowd, Kara knew one thing for sure. Change was coming. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, Kara felt that the fight was worth it. The work was only just beginning, but she was ready for it. With her allies by her side, and the voices of countless others rising in unison, she knew that nothing could stand in their way. The future was uncertain, but Kara Montgomery had already proven that even the most entrenched systems could be shaken. Change was not only possible, it was inevitable.